Again, I'm Kris Mecholsky. I was recently hired into the Office of Research Advancement, and which is, as you heard, generously sponsoring this talk and the series that it inaugurates, Writing Science series. More on that later. I'm actually really humbled by the interest in this talk. I received several emails. People have stopped me to talk about it, and which has surprised me a little bit. I actually gave a talk in this room at the beginning of the spring semester on Sherlock Holmes. And while I was happy with the turnout for that, I never thought a discussion on the particularities of grammar in the English language would outshine it, but here we are. So you may be wondering what my qualifications are for talking to you about writing in the sciences. And actually, in a private discussion with a friend who is a chemist at a small college in the Northeast, she said, frankly, you don't know how we write, and it's often almost reverse. Just to clarify, she meant people in the humanities, not specifically me. It seems harsh, especially as large as it is right now. She said, what we always want is more inclusion of science writing into standard writing courses, which are always taught by non-scientists about non-science writing. The problem is that essentially it requires scientists to be involved, which we often don't have time or interest in doing. She then went on to suggest, actually, that with regard to writing in science, what people want is learning how to write grants. That's different, and learning and practicing more about that would be good, but only if it's taught by someone who actually is in that field and knows what they want. Now, I happen to agree with her point about writing instruction in the sciences, and I'm currently working on ways here at LSU to do that better. But I do disagree a little bit with her first statement. Now, I understand that no academic, myself included, likes someone to come stumbling into his or her field of expertise, bad-mouthing it, and claiming to be able to fix it. And I want to put you at ease that that's not what I'm doing here. In fact, I think you'll find that this talk has less to do with your particular field, whatever that may be, and more to do with how it's oriented to the outside world. It's true that each discipline has its own conventions and ways of talking to itself. But this talk is more about the space between the sciences and the rest of the world, about how everyone else understands you. I think that begins at basic journal writing and book writing, as it does in every field, but it extends to grant writing and to popular articles and speeches. And in recent years, scientific communication has gained increasing importance, relevance, and urgency. The tools for writing that postdocs and young scientists especially develop for grant writing and communicating with the public at large begin at the level of discourse of writing within the discipline. And the elements of writing in those genres are not really so different, even if they have different conventions, as I hope you'll see as the talk progresses. So mainly I want to clear up some confusion about active and passive voice in scientific writing today and some of the myths that persist about it. And in fact, the problem is kind of a long-standing one. To illustrate that point, I'd like to offer a little anecdote. I was no more than 7 when my father, a material scientist at Penn State at the time, wrote an item for the American Ceramics Society Bulletin titled Engineering Research Needs of Advanced Ceramics and Ceramic Matrix Composites. Now, my father comes from a strong liberal arts background, so he wrote this in as clear prose as he could and sent it off. It came back with a heavy editorial suggestion: rewrite it in the passive voice. Irritated as he wasn't surprised, and I imagine a number of you wouldn't be either. Writing with preference for the passive voice has been a truism of scientific writing for a very long time, most of the 20th century, in fact, but not actually as much before that. Its relative permanence is due partially to tradition and partially to, I guess I'll say, oversight. Because while you can find a gentle suggestion in a 1961 scientific style manual, let me see if I can, there we go. The passive voice is preferred since the emphasis is not so much on the person who does a given experiment or study as it is on the results of that study. It's actually a little surprising that in 2017 you can find a much more direct admonition. This is from the Journal of Experimental Marine Biology and Ecology. All papers should, that's sick there, that's not supposed to be there. All papers should all be written in third person passive voice. But one reason this is actually so surprising is that we've actually more or less turned the tide on this. Now, that is to say, the tide has turned in a number of professional journals and organizations and even grant awarding institutions and their style guides. So here's just a brief list, not at all exhaustive. And I didn't spend very much time finding these. You'll notice, Journal of Dairy Science, Journal of Endodontics. Going down, you see the American Chemical Society, American Medical Association, Science, Nature, NIH grants, CDC journals and grants. These are all institutions or organizations that in their style guides specifically say, write in the active voice. The ones that are asterisked are ones that, and like a number of other journals and organizations, don't have specific style guides, but refer authors to general style guides, all of which suggest writing in the active voice. And so even, and incidentally, this does, in fact, extend to some of the organizations and organizations that suggest writing in the passive voice. At other sections in their style guide, they refer back to general style guides, which, again, refer to active voice. So the long-standing, but in first-year writing students who often finish their humanities requirements quickly, and in the apprenticeship of junior colleagues with their mentors, the passive voice still tends to linger on a lot more prevalently than it should. And the long-standing assumption, actually, that passive writing is encouraged in the sciences has actually even made its way into the humanities. So this is from I guess I don't know the metrics of this, but I would definitely stand by saying this is probably the most popular style guide that most writing students, undergraduates, use. It's Purdue's online writing lab. You can search Purdue OWL. Anytime you look up some grammar point, you're almost likely going to find a section of the OWL site. And this is what they have to say about scientific writing. In scientific writing, passive voice is more readily accepted, since using it allows one to write without using personal pronouns or the names of particular researchers as the subjects of sentences, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And essentially suggests that you should keep going with this. So even though, as you will continue to see as the talk goes on, the vast majority of scientific journals and grant awarding institutions now urge the prevalent use of active voice, the myth persists. So what's the big deal? Why would so many people so studiously write in a passive voice for so long when they hadn't really before, and then suddenly and so strenuously argue that they really shouldn't? What changed? What was wrong to begin with, or not wrong? And most important, what do we do now? How do I write in the active voice? What is the active voice? Should I never write in the passive voice again? Have I ever? So I'll just spoil the whole talk right now in a bit of a disappointing way. So should I use the active or passive voice? It depends, and it's complicated. But essentially, I'm going to urge you, when you leave the room, to write in the active voice more often than before, whenever possible, in fact, and to reserve the passive voice for its necessary uses, which do happen. The problem isn't necessarily with the passive voice itself, but how it can be overused. So what is voice? To answer that, we just need to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty of grammar and language. But to do that, we also have to have an agreement about how language works, to some degree. Presumably, right, it's our way of communicating our thoughts to other people, to express our thoughts about ourselves and about the world. But if you say it like this, it can lead to the misconception that there are these idealized thoughts just sitting in our head that get put into words and placed out into the world. In this conception, it doesn't really matter how poorly you say something, because if the idea is sound, it'll shine through. Maybe there will be some confusion. Maybe the listener or reader will have to work a little bit harder to figure out what that thought is. But the thinking is, if the reader works hard enough at it, they can find that thought, shine it up a little bit, and understand it. And this is that myth of the reclusive, misunderstood genius, isn't it? His brilliance is so all-consuming, he can't be bothered to wrap up his brilliance into nice, neat, easily consumable packages for the whole world to receive. He doesn't have the time nor inclination to pretty up his words so the medicine of science goes down easier. But in following this myth, worrying about how you phrase something really doesn't matter. Who cares if you use 20 words or 10, or 5 words instead of 30? Who cares about how many adjectives or adverbs you use? If the thinking is good, the myth goes, it will shine through. But this is a flawed way of thinking about language. Our thoughts comprise language. Language builds up our thinking. We piece together our world by piecing together words. We identify intuitions and emotions by selecting the right words for those intuitions and emotions. And the words we have in our brains to identify are what we use to think with. And the ways we can arrange those words actually reflect the way we think and our ability to think. Okay, so how does English work? I'm just going to go into this a little bit briefly. So language expresses states and events. So you have statements that are like, the block is red. These are just basic statements kind of identifying something, labeling it as something. And then a broader selection of sentences have to do with action, right? How objects work. So you have nouns like this block doing something, right? That's the verb. And pardon me, I hope that you can see that all right. I don't know if we can turn off one of the back lights. Is that visible? I guess that's visible to you. We have different words to describe those nouns, those objects, adjectives. And we have words to describe the verbs, which are called adverbs. Right? And then we have some other words that help us figure out some of these different objects together. Right? So, and then their relation to each other. So you have what you call prepositions, right, that tell you where something is in relation to something else in time and space. And you have conjunctions that kind of group things together or apart. So all of the basic aspects of grammar are based on all of these individual elements. And you can alter verbs to talk about how real or urgent a situation is. That's mood, like do this or if you were to do that. You can alter the verbs to talk about when it happened. That's tense, right? Past, present, and future. And you can alter the verbs for how long something was happening. Was it continuous? Did it end? Is it still happening? All right, so that's just a brief little thing. So with this notion of grammar in mind, we might see how voice is actually kind of a critical part of grammar with respect to describing and analyzing reality, science. Because voice describes the relationship between an action and its participants. All right, so, and I forgot to mention one, the determiner, which just kind of identifies one object versus another. So that person versus that person. So to get out of the thick woods of grammar, just to talk about voice, this is how voice has to do. If we were to describe this situation, a ball, here we know that we see a ball is getting kicked or a ball is getting hit. In this situation, we don't know who's doing the hitting. So we're forced to focus on the object itself. The ball is getting hit. The ball is being hit. I don't know much more than that. That's passive voice. We don't know the mechanism behind that, so we're focusing on what we do know. It could be a foot. A person is kicking the ball. That's put into the active voice. A foot kicks the ball. Just as likely, maybe not just as likely, it could be Godzilla. Godzilla shooting forth the ball from his mouth, which is why maybe if you looked at the sheet that you have in front of you, you're puzzled by the random Godzilla thing, but I don't know. I could pick anything. And that's kind of the point, right? Before we know what did it, it's just a ball getting hit or a ball getting ejected. We don't even know. We don't know if it was getting thrown, hit, or if maybe nobody intentionally hit it or ejected it. But here you know, Godzilla ejected the ball, right? So, sorry for that little black spot right there, but active voice would say Godzilla ejected the ball. We identified the subject of the sentence right there, Godzilla, and the verb, what he did. The ball is the object, the direct object, the receiver of the action. In passive voice, and you can, here incidentally, just to remind you, again, in case grammar is a bit vague in your past, which completely excusable, the adjective, right, describes the subject, ferocious Godzilla. Adverb describing the verb there, forcefully ejected the ball into the air. There's the preposition describing the relation into the world, okay? Passive voice, the ball was ejected. We don't know who did it. And in fact, in this situation, the actor, the agent doing that action is completely erased. We just have the subject and the verb, but the subject is actually the object in the previous one. Things are a little topsy-turvy here. You can hopefully add in by Godzilla, right, kind of returning the agent. And this is how, incidentally, if you're trying to figure out if you have passive voice in your writing, the fastest way to figure out if you do have it or not is by searching for by. You can just do a Control F on your document and search for by. Now, some of the bys will be correct and don't erase all of them necessarily, but it's a fast way of finding where you might be using it. The other way is to look for the verb to be in its various forms, is, was, were. Again, not every time you come upon the verb to be is it going to be using a passive voice, but these are some helpful tools that can help you start to find those. So the active voice grammatically privileges and then mentally privileges the agent of an action. The passive voice grammatically privileges and thus mentally privileges the direct object of the action, and it de-emphasizes, or as I pointed out, even erases, right, the agent altogether. But there might be a reason for that. I'm not here to argue that you should only use active voice. You might actually have a reason that you want to focus on just the direct object. All right? So let's get out of the English part of it and get into the sciences. Let's look at from some real world examples. I'm going to look briefly at some scientific journals and then see how we can also understand how that has led to grant writing as well. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, one reason that it's important, I think, to focus on journal writing is that that's your main practice early on for grant writing later. If you have no other indication of it, and if you only had that one or maybe two English classes very early on, and I mean, a lot of times some of the brightest students tend to get out of one of their writing sections. So they only have one writing class that they take first semester freshman year. They don't practice writing again for a long time. And then they only have their mentors later on to follow. And again, as I pointed out, 20th century has been a long-standing use of passive voice. So they're used to journal writing. They're used to whatever their mentors or the people around them are doing. And maybe, and for maybe very good reasons, they haven't had a lot of time to sit around with the English language. Okay. But then when you get to a point where you're starting to talk to people who are giving out your money, and they don't care about the sciences, they've spent their whole time studying the law maybe. They want clear, concise writing. So we're going to take a look at how those transition. So here I have some selections from a recent article in Physical Review Letters on the gravitational waves result that came from last year, as many of you are aware, since LSU was such a part of that. And here you have a really strong use of active voice. Okay? We have an extremely strong, this is the opening line from it, a century after the fundamental predictions of Einstein and Schwarzschild, we report the first direct detection of gravitational waves and the first direct observation of a binary black hole system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Our observations provide unique access. This is strong language. It's memorable language. I mean, I don't know if, maybe like yourself, you may have logged in, I forget what site I happened to be streaming it on that day, but I was watching the announcement. It was exciting. This is exciting. This is quotable. If you Google search some of these terms, a lot of those exact terms were used in the different news pieces about this discovery. You also see it even in the observation section, right? We have the observatories, the Hanford and Livingston observatories detected the coincident signal, GW 150914. This could have been written in the passive voice in the maybe traditional 20th century scientific way, right? By saying the signal was detected by our observatories. But in fact, that ends up erasing what the agency of the scientists involved in it. It actually is important that the observatories detected this. Okay? One of the reasons that active voice has become increasingly important or increasingly used in the sciences is the understanding, especially throughout the course of 20th century science, that the people involved in the observations might end up affecting to some degree the observations. And you'll see that in a later paper too. I will note in this one, I think it's in this one, you will notice that there is still a use, though, of passive voice, but it's properly used here. It's used for an intentional reason. The initial detection was made by. Here, we're focusing on the object, the detection. We're making that the noun, that whole detection. Because here, describing that detection is of primary importance. We said our observatories detected this thing, and that detection was made by low latency searches for generic gravitational wave transients, et cetera, et cetera. So the point here being, this very, very specific ways in which it was detected is of a little bit less importance. The primary focus right here is how the detection was made. So that's forefront in our minds. In this situation, we have a good use of passive. Only the LIGO detectors we're observing at the time. Okay? Here, we're talking about specifically, we're focusing our attention on those detectors again. So in a weird way, this is still kind of focusing on that agency. But you end up using the passive voice in this particular case. The Virgo detector was being upgraded. It doesn't maybe matter so much if they were running a specific software update. We don't need to know some software engineers came into our lab and ran some upgrades on blankety blank blank. We don't need to hear that. The important part is just that they were being upgraded. The detector was being upgraded. But then you might have a situation like this where you might not even know if it's passive or active, which is why it's helpful to have somebody maybe go over your paper. And so I'm glad to hear anybody's thoughts on this. The basic features of the basic features of this point to it being produced by the coalescence of two black holes. So this is not a rhetorical question. Is this active or passive voice?
Active and passive, both, yeah.
Weird, right? Can it be both? This is the question, right? Or where is it buried in? So we see both, right? Kind of feels like both. The basic features point to it being produced by. Yeah, there's a buried passive voice in here. It's active voice, and then a buried passive voice within that. It's tricky. This would be tricky if you weren't fully aware of it. And you actually might go through and trying to erase all of your byes, doing that quick Control F. You might go in there, I got to get rid of that. But this is actually in the active voice. And then it's subordinating a certain part of it that is not as necessary. The point is, it's the features of the signal. The features of the signal indicate something. That's what we're focusing on. I want to focus our attention now on something from that Journal of Experimental Marine Biology and Ecology that I mentioned earlier that indicated you should only write in the third-person passive voice. What I think is so fun, incidentally, about this particular journal, and incidentally, I want to indicate, this is actually a really great paper, and I'm in no way denigrating the paper. As I pointed out, my father wrote that passive voice constructed bulletin. It has nothing to do with even how well written it is in the passive voice. I'm only pointing it out to indicate ways in which you might be able to rewrite it. So just want to be really clear about that. I'm not denigrating the science behind this or even the writing, just to point it out for us. So in this situation, we have, this is a paper on kelp entitled The Influence of Water Motion on the Growth Rate of the Kelp Laminaria digitata. I think that the G is G, I don't know. Prediction of the hydrodynamic conditions, this is the beginning of the materials and methods. Prediction of the hydrodynamic conditions at the sampling sites for the duration of the study was derived from the combined output of the Strangford-Lau flow and the Strangford-Lau wave models. So this is a really long subject. This is a really, really long subject. The entire subject of the sentence is prediction of the hydrodynamic conditions at the sampling sites for the duration of the study. And honestly, was derived from, we know who's doing the deriving. It's kind of important, actually, that the scientists are actually determining a specific way in which they want to derive these predictions, because they might have chosen a different way. So this would be a good opportunity to rewrite this in the active voice. I don't mean to put anybody on the spot, but how would you rewrite this into the active voice? Anybody? Yeah.
We predicted, and then the rest.
Exactly, that's it. We predicted, and it's clearer and a lot stronger. We predicted our predictions of the hydrodynamic conditions. You could also switch things around a little bit. You could say for the duration of the study, comma, to kind of let the person know at the outset, this is talking about what we did for the whole study. For the duration of the study, comma, we derived our predictions based on this. Okay? And I believe that is on your sheet. Is it? I can't remember anymore. I think it was on your sheet, this specific example. Here's another situation where I would highlight the active voice. Again, this is for a journal that specified that it wanted you to write in the third person passive. And I'm sure anybody would agree with you that if you're writing for a journal that specifies that you write in the passive voice, write in the passive voice. But you'll find that most of them don't suggest that. Observations were carried out at 5 sites, this, and this. Well, that's kind of a big, this is an important thing that the scientists chose to do. They could have picked other places. Why did they pick these specific sites? Right? We carried out our observations at 5 sites, this, and this. That's a situation you would want to highlight the scientist's agency in that. It's not like this is just magic objective reality. They had to pick 5 different spots for good reasons, but this is an important time that you might want to highlight that. One thing I think is particularly, is it in this one? It is not in this one. One thing I think is actually kind of funny about this paper and another of other papers, including my father's, I ended up checking out, you gotta love libraries. I was able to check out my father's bulletin. I tried to find out if he had his draft on our old Mac, but that thing it was trashed a long time ago. So it was like 1989. But one thing that's funny is in both that bulletin and in this Kelp paper, you actually do have active voice. The combined components from the flow and wave models expressed, described the greatest, it's still a very long noun. Described there, that's an active voice. I don't know if that slipped through or if nobody really cared, but that's active voice. So it's funny because that admonition in the journal style guide was really firm. All papers should all be written in the third person passive voice. Well, that's not. That's an active voice right there. There's another one in here, I believe. I don't know if it's the next one. Another active voice, if I can find it. I'll read it, and if you can find it, where is it? These results. Okay, well, there we go. The CN ratios reflected, there are a number of different places you can do it. The CN ratios reflected the internal nutrient pool, which were indicative of nutrient limitation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's active voice, okay? So, it's really honestly very difficult to only write in the passive voice. I'm actually gonna point out to you a little bit later a link to, there were a series of letters in Nature in the mid-90s. They're fun to read. You should check out the link when you can. But 3 different academics arguing about use of passive or active voice in scientific literature. The funniest part was that the gentleman who was very, very severely promoting passive voice wrote almost his entire letter in the active voice, which one of the subsequent people writing definitely pointed out. I think the line was, and the gentleman's name was Leather, was his last name, is Leather should preach what he practices, which was effective. So this brings us to scientific proposals. You can see how this, again, I've pointed out that in the vast majority of journals you're going to come across, active voice is usually encouraged, and when it's not, they refer to something like Chicago style or some other style guide that recommends active voice. But you're also going to see it in some different grant awarding institutions. The 3 major grant awarding institutions at LSU, if I'm not mistaken, are NSF, NIH, and DOE. NSF is vague. They never really say this, but this is helpful because it's indicative of some of the language that happens, especially around grants, but also in journals. They just say a good proposal is always readable, well-organized, grammatically correct, and understandable. Careful writing should allow you to describe in the limited space available enough about your project to give the reviewers a clear idea of exactly what you plan to do and why your plan is a good one. As you'll come to see, the most consistent style suggestion is write clearly and write briefly. And the best way to write clearly and briefly is in the active voice. But it seems to be a kind of euphemism for that. Write clearly, write briefly. That's what they want. Clearly, brief. Clear and brief. And that is active voice. In every style guide you find, when it talks about active voice, they say, use the active voice because it is clearer and it is faster. Passive constructions tend to wordiness, like the by. The heavy nominalization that we saw at the beginning. Predictions of this word, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. That has this gigantic subject before you finally get to the verb. That's a lot for the human brain to work with. Can the person reading it figure it out? Yeah, but they might give up before they try. Okay? So that's NSF, but of the other 2, NIH is really clear about it. Use the active rather than passive voice. For example, write, we will develop an experiment, not an experiment will be developed. And that's, yeah, they're extremely clear about that. DOE was a little trickier for me to find. The best thing that I could find for DOE was there was a the best thing I could find was this GrantSat, self-assessment tool that was written by the Carlsbad area office and disseminated. And part of their, it was basically a way to kind of self-assess your grant. Sorry if you can't read that very well. I thought it was going to be bigger. But basically it says, here are the directions for how to do your self-assessment. Score your draft grant proposal. For each criterion in the self-assessment section, mark the number you believe best represents the content of your draft proposal. For example, this is there for example in the instructions. If 2/3 of your draft grant proposal is written in the passive voice, you might evaluate the active-passive voice criterion as a 2, and you'll never guess what's best here, 6 or 1. 6 is best. And they put 1 over here in the passive voice. So, however, if 2/3 of your draft proposal is written in the active voice, they suggest giving it a 5. So even 2/3 isn't good enough for DOE. And again, I apologize. I thought it'd be a little bit bigger. Computers can be misleading. You see here, this is the section on passive or active. And again, it has written in passive voice 1. Over here, 6 written in active voice. That's their way of assessing how well you wrote your grant proposal. I can't even read that anymore. I'm going to go over to the computer real quick. The other two say, and just to give you an indication of some of the other, what is bad grammar according to the DOE, you've got right there sloppily typed, unreadable, unprofessional looking. Above that, contains complex sentences construction. This is something you might be a little bit confused by. But what they prefer, the 6 here, is constructing simple sentences. All right, the more complicated, the more you bury your information within dependent clauses, within prepositional phrases toward the end of the sentence, the more obscure your language is. And according, again, to this self-assessment tool, that's a 1. You want to write in simple sentences. Just to go back, the other 2 things here were, these were from NSF. I was just kind of combing the NSF page on proposals. Then for project summary, they mentioned writing in the 3rd person. It should be written in the 3rd person, informative to other persons working in the same or related fields, and insofar as possible, understandable to a scientifically or technically literate lay reader. This is, again, one of the major aspects of grants, is that this needs to be readable by people beyond your scientific field. And that's that problem of starting out in journal writing and not having much other English practice before that, is that you're going to write that way. You're going to write the way that your peers are writing, and if it's just all if it's just maintained passive voice, when you get to the point where you actually have to write in the active voice per NSF, NIH, DOE, it's going to be hard to transition. Maybe more importantly, in their section on project description, they say it must contain as a separate section within the narrative a section labeled broader impacts. What's funny about this is, although it doesn't mention talking in the active voice, you're supposed to talk about how your research is going to impact something, which is in itself an active thing. This thing is going to affect this change, or this will affect people's perceptions of this, or this will do this. This whole section implies that you should be writing in some kind of active voice. Again, that's for NSF. This next one is from the National Cancer Institute in NIH. Again, it's this brief and specific. For clarity, each aim should consist of only 1 sentence. Use a brief paragraph under each aim if detail is needed. Most successful applications have 2 to 4 specific aims. But you come across this over and over again. Be brief and specific. Be clear and brief. Over and over again. Last, I'll end these specific examples with the CDC style guide. And again, it mentions ranging from letters to press releases to journal articles. This is a wide variety of things. And they have a very nice little rundown of active and passive voice. I'm not sure if I can zoom in on it right now. I hesitate to. Oh, good. Is that a little bit better, maybe? It's not great resolution. Is that, yeah? Okay. A verb in the active, and so I encourage you to take a look at this, right? A verb in the active voice when the performer of the act is the subject of the sentence. We've already talked about this, and they give you the example. As a rule, use the active voice because it is more accurate, direct, precise, and interesting. Active voice is shorter and easier to read. Again, that's that clarity and briefness. Or brevity. It also flows better. The passive voice traditionally was the norm in technical writing because it was considered to be more scientific or objective. Most journals now encourage the use of the active voice. I mean, that sums it up basically right there. The fact is that yes, the passive voice can sometimes feel much more objective, and it sometimes in fact is. If you don't know what caused some change, you probably shouldn't just randomly guess it just so you can write in the active voice. But that's why you wait until that moment to use the passive voice. You wait until there's a situation that warrants it. I don't know what caused this phenomenon. We just know that the phenomenon happened, so we're going to talk about it in the passive voice. This thing happened. The ball was ejected. We don't know if it was Godzilla or not. And it points out down here exactly those situations, which I'm going to see if I can scroll up a bit for you. Right? The passive voice is preferred in the following circumstances. Oh. Is that good? Okay. However, the passive voice is preferred in the following circumstances. When the subject is unknown. A memo was circulated in the office, if you've seen Jerry Maguire. The subject is irrelevant to the matter, or it's obvious. In the methods section, increasingly, even now as active voices encourage, in the methods and materials sections, things are often still written in the passive voice, because at some point it might get really boring to keep hearing you say, we measured this, then we measured this, then we measured this. You might switch to passive voice in those situations, because it's become obvious who the person doing the action is. It doesn't change. The emphasis needs to be on the object, not the subject. Smallpox was eradicated in 1980. In certain situations, you might be wanting to focus on that rather than the person who helped, or rather than the group of people who helped eradicate it. I put together a list of links on voice and scientific writing. They're not on your sheet, but I would be very glad to send some of these to you. I'll zoom in if you want to jot any of them down right now, but I'm going to give you my email address in just a second, and you can feel free to email me for any of these links. But just to let you know, here's some general information on voice and scientific writing, and there are a couple here debates on voice. There was this right here, this link at Utah, is a collection of the letters that were circulated in Nature. They're fun to read, honestly, just because they're kind of yelling back and forth at each other. It was at the advent of, or there was an editor leaving, and his basically parting remarks to the journal were right in the active voice, and then it elicited all of these letters in response. But also there have been some popular articles like at Slate or the Science magazine on how to write in the sciences. But then again, a couple of different handouts that kind of go in depth. So if you want to pass on any of this information to students or colleagues or just for your own reference, they're good to go to. Again, you can get those. Oh, do you want me to go back to, I don't know if anybody was finished writing them down, but I will definitely feel free to email me. I'm going to give you that at the end. I just wanted to end by thanking the Office of Research and Economic Development and the Office of Research Advancement for underwriting this talk in the ongoing series, particularly Dr. Kuselas, Kelly Robertson, Anand Ramachandran, and to Haley Hatfield for filming this. And I wanted to encourage you. This right here is just the mission, right, for the Office of Research Advancement. And I just wanted to point out that as this talk goes on, this office is here to help facilitate external funding, help facilitate gaining new sources of funding through technical support, through editing, things like this. And one of the purposes of this talk is that, or this talk series, is that we want to hear from you all about what different writing needs you have or would like to talk about, do workshops on. It's not all going to be me, don't worry. But I'd like to have your input about who we can reach out to, both within the university and outside of the university, to help you write grants, write articles, write press releases, write whatever. So please, 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 I'm going to move that mouse so you can see that better. Please email me and give me your thoughts about what aspects of writing you'd most like to focus on. That is a 1. So it's K-M-E-C-H-O, the letter O, and then the number 1 at lsu.edu. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'd be glad to answer any questions or respond to any comments you might have, as long as they're not too negative. Thank you.